My father sealed that room this summer I turned 18. I remember the sound of the lock going in. He did it himself, a deadbolt he installed on a Tuesday afternoon. And when I asked him what was in there, he said, just some things, and went back inside. And that was the only conversation we ever had about it. He was in that room, I know now, every day for 30 years after that. He died in March. He left me the house and the key and a note in his handwriting that said, "For Joe. He'll know what to do with it." My sister said burn it. My brother said sell the house and don't bother opening it. Dad didn't have anything worth keeping, Joe. You know that. And some part of me, God forgive me, almost agreed, because we had all decided a long time ago who our father was. He was the school janitor, the quiet man, the one who sat at the table and didn't say much and, we thought, didn't have much to say. I was wrong about my father in a way I'm still not finished understanding. And the proof was in that room, 30 years of it, waiting for me to be ready to look. My name is Joe Mather. I'm 48 years old. I run a plumbing supply business in the same town I grew up in, the same streets my father walked for 40 years as the custodian at Jefferson Elementary. I'm a practical man. I deal in pipes and fittings, and I price jobs by the foot, and I'm not the kind of man who tends toward the dramatic. I say this because what I found in my father's room is the kind of thing that could make a man sound like he's exaggerating, and I want you to know that I'm not. Everything I'm about to tell you is exactly what I found, and I've checked and rechecked enough times now that I'm certain of every detail. I'm an accountant's son. I count things twice. My father's name was Henry George Mather. He was 74 years old when he died, and he worked as the head custodian at Jefferson Elementary for 38 years, and he raised 3 children after my mother passed, and he went to church on Sundays, and he kept a small garden, and he was, as far as anyone who knew him could tell, a simple and quiet man who had never done anything remarkable in his life. Before I tell you what was in that room, do me one small kindness. If you ever looked at someone you loved and decided, without really looking, that you already knew everything about them, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the right person. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you something I can't answer for myself, and I want to hear how you'd handle it. Let me tell you about my father, the version we all believed. Henry Mather was a man of very few words. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. He was actually, functionally, someone who spoke very little. Not from shyness, exactly, but from something more like a conviction that he didn't have things worth saying. When my mother was alive, she did most of the talking for both of them, and my father listened and smiled and occasionally nodded or laughed at the right moment. When she died, I was 22, my sister Karen 19, my brother Rob 16. The house got very quiet, and it stayed that way. Dad cooked dinner and drove us where we needed to go and showed up at every school event and every game and every graduation. And he was warm in the way that a man can be warm without words. But if you'd asked any of us what our father thought about anything, what he believed, what he dreamed of, what he wanted for his life or ours, we'd have looked at each other and come up blank. We thought we knew why. We thought there wasn't much there to know. I want to be honest about that, because it's the hardest part to admit. We had written our father off. Not cruelly. There was real love there, I want to be clear about that. But somewhere between his silence and our busy lives, we had quietly decided that Henry Mather was a man of limited inner life. The janitor, the quiet one, the man who sat at the head of the table and kept things running and didn't need anything from the world beyond what he already had. You let us believe it. That's the part I'm still working through. The locked room was just part of the furniture of our childhood, the one door in the house that was always shut. We'd knock sometimes when we were young, and he'd say just a minute and come out and close it behind him, and we'd ask what was in there, and he'd say just some things, and we'd shrug and go back to our lives because we were children, and children accept the world as it is. When we were teenagers, we made guesses, old junk, maybe his tools, maybe some private thing from before our mother. When we were adults, we stopped wondering, mostly because we'd stopped wondering much about our father at all. After he died, my sister Karen was the practical one. Joe, she said on the phone from Phoenix, just open it, clear it out, and get the house on the market. Whatever's in there is 30 years of an old man's junk. Just deal with it. My brother Rob, who hadn't been back to the house in 4 years, said roughly the same thing. Sell it, Joe. Dad didn't have anything valuable. He worked as a school janitor, for God's sake. And there it was, that sentence, that quiet verdict we'd all carried for years. He worked as a school janitor, as if that settled the question of who a man was. I don't know exactly why I didn't just clear it out. I've thought about it since, and I think the honest answer is the note. For Joe, he'll know what to do with it. He'd thought about who he wanted to open that room, and he'd chosen me. Not because I was the eldest. Rob's the eldest. Not because I lived closest. Karen's only 40 minutes away. He chose me specifically, and he left a note that said I know what to do, and standing in the hallway of my father's house with the key in my hand, I felt, for the first time in a long time, that my father had spoken directly to me, and I wasn't willing to hear it with a garbage bag in the other hand. So I opened the door. If you're still with me, do me that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what I found, because what I found is the reason I'm still sitting with this 6 months later, still figuring out who my father actually was and who that makes me. I want to tell you about the smell first, because it's how I knew, before I could see anything clearly, that I'd been wrong about my father for a long time. Books, paper, and ink. The specific, warm, complicated smell of a room where a person has been reading and writing for decades. The kind of smell that old libraries have, and that you only get when a room has been lived in with that particular kind of purpose. Not mustiness, not dust and old junk. The smell of a working room. The smell of a mind at work, accumulated over years. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12, and it was full, not crammed with junk, not cluttered the way a storage room gets cluttered. Full the way a study is full, the way a scholar's room is full, with intention and order, everything placed on purpose. There were shelves along 2 walls, and on the shelves were notebooks. Dozens of them. The black and white speckle composition notebooks you buy at a drugstore, except they were everywhere, and they were labeled, and they were dated, and the dates went back 30 years. I stood in the doorway for a long time before I went in. I pulled the first notebook off the shelf, the earliest date, 1994, the summer he locked the door, and I opened it to the first page. And there was my father's handwriting. Not the sparse, functional handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists. Something else entirely. Full sentences, paragraphs, pages of it, careful and even and patient, going all the way to the bottom of the page and turning over without breaking stride. I read the first paragraph. Then I sat down on the floor of my father's room because my legs gave out from under me. He was writing about my mother, about the day they met, a specific day, June 14th, 1971, at a church social, and he described it the way a novelist describes things. The light through the window, the song that was playing, the exact way she turned her head when someone called her name. And it was good. Not good for a school janitor, just good. The kind of thing you'd read in a real book and underline. My father, who he thought had nothing to say, had been saying it all along. Just not to us. Just in here, in this room, with the door locked for 30 years. I didn't leave that room for 4 hours. What was in those notebooks, and there were 63 of them, I counted, was the interior life of a man I had never known existed. He had been writing since the summer I turned 18, the summer he locked the door, and he had been writing about everything. His memories of his own childhood, growing up the son of a factory worker in a neighborhood that no longer exists. His years in the Navy, which he had never once mentioned to any of us. The early years of his marriage, stories about my mother that I'd never heard, that lit up a version of her I'd only half known. The years after she died, the grief he'd carried, the conversations he'd had with her photograph in the evenings when he thought we were all asleep. And there was the family history, spanning 2 full shelves, 32 notebooks, a separate project running parallel to the journals, was a complete account of the Mather family. Not just our immediate family, the whole line. He had written to relatives he tracked down through church records and census records and letters. He had driven, he wrote, as far as North Carolina and as far as Ohio, on his weekends over the years, visiting elderly cousins and distant aunts, recording their recollections in his careful hand. He had found photographs and had them copied and preserved. He had documented births and deaths and migrations and marriages going back 5 generations. in the back of the last research notebook, in his handwriting. I could not find everything, but I found enough. Enough for them to know they come from something real and something good. I sat with that sentence for a while. My father, who Rob said had never done anything remarkable, who we all thought had nothing worth keeping, had spent 30 years building his family a foundation, not in wood or concrete, which would have been the practical metaphor for a man like me, in words, in paper, in the accumulated record of who we were and where we'd come from, so that none of us would ever have to feel like we came from nothing. He'd done it in secret because he didn't believe we'd want it, didn't believe a janitor's handwritten research was something his children would value. He'd done it anyway, and he'd locked the door because showing it to us, unfinished, would have meant hearing us tell him it didn't matter. He thought we'd say it didn't matter. And honestly, I sit with this every day. I don't know if we'd have proved him wrong. There was one more thing. At the very back of the shelf, behind the research notebooks, were 4 slim notebooks bound together with a rubber band. One for each of us, me, Karen, Rob, and the youngest, my sister Dana, who died when she was 9, before the room was ever locked. And inside each notebook was a chapter. Just one, long chapter. His children, described the way only a father who had watched them for decades could describe them. I read mine first, of course. And here is where I have to stop and tell you that what I'm about to say is true, and I know it sounds like the kind of thing a person says about a letter from their dead father, and it might sound sentimental or inflated. But you have to understand that I'm an accountant's son and a practical man, and I am telling you exactly what was on the page. My father wrote that I was the one who had my mother's way of seeing the world. Not her eyes, which everyone always mentioned, but her way of seeing the ability to walk into a broken situation and find the one thing that needed fixing, without panic, without drama. He wrote that when I was 7 years old and the kitchen flooded and my mother was crying and he didn't know what to do, I'd walked in from the backyard and said, "The pipe under the sink is loose. I saw it this morning." And that was when he first understood who I was. He wrote that I'd spent my whole life underestimating what I was capable of, and that this made him sad, but that he believed I would figure it out in my own time. Because the right people always do, just slower than everyone else wants them to. He wrote, "I have never worried about Joe. I have always believed in him completely. I just never knew how to tell him, because I was never any good with words." He was never any good with words. The man who had written 63 notebooks over 30 years, the man whose description of a June afternoon in 1971 was as vivid and specific as anything I'd ever read. That man had told himself, his whole life, that he wasn't any good with words. And so he put them all in a locked room. And he'd sat at the dinner table in silence for 30 years, because he believed, sincerely and completely, that he had nothing worth saying. I stayed in that room until the sun went down. And I called my sister Karen, not to tell her I'd been right, not to prove anything, but because there was a slim notebook at the back of the shelf with her name on it, and it was hers, and she deserved to know what was in it. I called her and I said, "Karen, I need you to come here. I need you to see what Dad left us." She didn't believe me at first. She came 3 days later on a Thursday, and I let her into the room and let her walk around it and touch the notebooks. And I watched her face go through what mine had gone through, which is the specific and irreversible process of understanding that you were wrong about someone you loved for a very long time. I read her chapter out loud, because she had told me to burn it, and she needed to hear it with her own voice in the room, I think. And I watched Karen, my practical, direct, get-it-done sister who had last cried at our mother's funeral, sit on the floor of our father's room and cry for about 20 minutes. And I sat beside her and didn't say anything, because I'd learned from 63 notebooks that sometimes the right thing is to be quiet and present and let the thing be what it is. Rob came the following weekend. He read his own chapter in silence. And when he was done, he set it down and he looked at me and he said he watched everything. He saw everything. Why didn't he say any of it? And I told him the truth, the only answer I had, because he thought he wasn't any good with words. Because he was a janitor's son who became a janitor, and he'd spent his whole life being told, in the quiet ways the world tells certain men, that what was in his head wasn't worth the air it would take to say it. So he put it on paper in a locked room for 30 years. Not for nothing. For us. He always meant it for us. He just needed to be gone before he could give it. I've been working with a local historian to figure out what to do with the family research. It covers 5 generations in this county, and she tells me it's the most complete single-family primary record she's ever encountered for families of her background, and that a regional archive would be honored to have it. The journals are ours. I've been reading them slowly, a little at a time, the way you read something you don't want to end. I still run the plumbing supply business. I still deal in pipes and joints and pressure gauges and the practical, unglamorous infrastructure of how water moves through the world. And I've been thinking these last 6 months about my father through that lens, because in plumbing, the thing that matters is never the thing you can see. It's the pipe in the wall. It's the pressure behind the surface. The finished room is just the finish. Everything that makes the house livable is hidden, running through the places nobody ever thinks to look, doing its work invisibly for decades, and you only notice it when something goes wrong. My father was a school janitor and a quiet man, and someone who was never any good with words. He was also the most thorough, patient, loving, and eloquent person I have ever known. Both of those things were true at the same time for 74 years. The difference between who he thought he was and who he actually was is the difference between the surface of a wall and what's running through it. And I spent 48 years never thinking to look inside the wall. He said I'd know what to do with it. And I think now I understand what he meant. Not sell the house. Not burn the junk. Do what I'm doing right now. Tell people about it. Tell people that the quiet man at the end of your table, the one who doesn't say much, the one you've decided doesn't have much to say, you might be wrong. You might be sitting across from 30 years of locked rooms. You might be one conversation away from meeting your father for the first time. He wasn't any good with words. I've read his words 50 times now. Every time I find something new. So here's my question, and I turn it over every night. My father chose to keep all of it locked away in silence for 30 years. He never showed us while he was alive. He let us think he was simple. He let us love him for the simple man we thought he was, instead of the complicated and extraordinary one he actually was. Was that kindness protecting us from the weight of it while he was still here? Or did he rob us of 30 years of knowing him? Does a man have the right to take his interior life to the grave, even from the people who loved him? Tell me down in the comments. I genuinely don't know. If this story meant something to you, do me that kindness. Subscribe, hit like, and this week, ask the quiet person in your life a real question. Not how are you? Something real. Something that requires an answer with actual words. You might be surprised what's been waiting in the locked room. I'll see you next time. A note before you go. This story is a work of fiction, written and dramatized for entertainment. The names, characters, and events are invented, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But if its lesson stayed with you, that the people who seem to have nothing to say are sometimes the ones who have been saying everything all along, just not out loud, then it did its job. Go find the locked rooms. Open them gently. We'll see you in the next one.